Hi there, I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
They left a bottle of wine in the fridge and a note that said, "Gone to the Keys, just us four this year, sweetie. Don't wait up." So I changed the locks before they even hit the state line. When my parents first moved in, it was supposed to be just for a couple of weeks, maybe a month tops. My dad had a minor stroke, and with rehab being what it is, the doctor suggested he recover somewhere quiet, familiar, low stress. And my house? Well, it checked all those boxes. I work from home, I don't have kids, and I have a nice finished basement with a private bathroom, which, in theory, would have made their stay comfortable for everyone involved. What I didn't realize at the time, what I should have known based on years of experience, is that just a couple of weeks in my family has never meant what it sounds like. In my family, that phrase is basically code for forever unless you raise hell, and I didn't, not right away. At first, I was actually happy to help. I figured this would be a chance to reconnect, maybe get a little closer to my dad after years of awkward phone calls and one-word text replies. He was always a bit distant, military guy, all routine and no warmth, but I figured maybe when people get older, they soften a little. Maybe he'd appreciate me stepping up. I was wrong. What I got instead was a grown man who commandeered my living room for 8 hours a day to watch daytime TV at volume levels that rattled the baseboards. A mom who acted like the guest room I'd set up was somehow unclean because I'd used the wrong kind of pillowcases, and a general sense that my house had suddenly become less mine and more ours, with the hour heavily skewed in their direction. At first, it was little things. My mom started organizing my pantry. She claimed she was just helping, but it always ended with her putting everything somewhere I couldn't find it, like the flour in the fridge or the vinegar under the bathroom sink. Then she started tidying up my mail, which meant opening it. I thought it might be important, she'd chirp with a smile, already halfway through reading a medical bill addressed to me. My dad didn't say much, but his presence was heavy. He'd sit in my favorite chair with his shoes off and socks rolled down, muttering about commercials and flipping through the channels like he was still in his own house. Lori, my younger sister, lives 2 states away and barely visits, but she somehow always found time to call and play the martyr, checking in on how I was handling everything, while carefully reminding me that they were old and fragile and needed a little grace. Convenient, really, how she managed to keep her hands clean while I was waist-deep in caretaking duty. Still, I kept biting my tongue. I told myself it was temporary, even as the months stretched on and the guest room morphed into their bedroom, and the den slowly filled up with their old furniture for storage. And then with their dog, who they swore would just be visiting, but somehow ended up with a bed in my kitchen and a vet appointment on my credit card. It wasn't until early November, 11 months after they'd moved in, that I started noticing real red flags. One night, after logging off work, I went to order groceries online like I always do, only to find my card had already been charged for a large order, one I didn't remember placing. And it wasn't even my usual star. I checked my Amazon account next, and saw that a round-trip flight had been booked to Miami under my name, but with Lori's information on the passenger list. I thought it was a glitch, until I saw the billing address, mine. The email confirmation had been sent to my inbox, which is probably the only reason I caught it. I sat there staring at the screen, confused, until the pieces started falling into place. Slowly, then all at once. I walked into the kitchen, holding my laptop, where my mom was peeling carrots like nothing was wrong. I asked her if she knew anything about a flight booking, keeping my voice even, trying not to explode. She blinked at me, looked at the carrots like they might offer a better answer, and said, "Oh, that Lori handled it. We didn't think you'd want to come, and it's just us 4 this year anyway. We figured you'd enjoy the peace and quiet." I didn't know what stunned me more, the casual tone or the assumption that I was somehow not part of the immediate family. I stood there silent, watching her drain a pot of potatoes while humming like we hadn't just crossed a major boundary. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, Besides, you've always said the holidays stress you out. This way you don't have to host, right? She handed me a spoonful of mashed potatoes like it was all some kind of favor. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times I'd said yes when I should have said no, how I skipped a friend's wedding to stay home with my dad when his blood pressure spiked, how I turned down a promotion because it would have meant traveling more and being less available. I remembered the subtle guilt trips, the way my mom would sigh dramatically whenever I made plans that didn't include them, and how Lori always managed to stay on the good side by doing absolutely nothing. The next morning, I heard something that snapped the last piece of patience right out of me. I was walking down the hallway toward the kitchen when I heard my mom's voice through the guest room door. She was on the phone with someone, probably Lori. "She's not going to do anything," she said, voice low and smug. "She never does. That's the thing with Tara. She talks big, but she just keeps giving." I stopped mid-step. That sentence, it didn't just sting, it clarified everything. It told me that not only were they using me, but they were confident I wouldn't stop them. That this was the role they'd carved out for me and I was expected to stay in it. Dutiful, quiet, predictable. So the day they left, while they were boarding their plane and sipping their complimentary drinks, I drove to the hardware store and picked up a new set of locks. By that evening, their keys were useless. I moved their things, nicely, carefully, into the garage, each item packed and labeled. I changed all my passwords, canceled the shared cards, and set my voicemail to auto-decline any number that started with their area code. They said it was just us four this year, so I gave them what they wanted. It's strange how quickly your memory sharpens once you give yourself permission to stop pretending everything is fine. And in the days following my parents' cheerful departure to a sun-soaked resort that I apparently wasn't immediate enough to be invited to, my brain started pulling up moments I'd ignored, details I'd explained away with excuses that no longer made sense, fragments of conversations and behaviors that now felt suspicious in a way they hadn't when I was still locked into the role of silent provider. It wasn't just the groceries or the flight reservations that had magically appeared under my accounts. It was how natural it all seemed to them, how little they felt the need to hide it. The real shock wasn't that they'd used my money. It was that they didn't think I'd notice, and worse, they didn't think I'd care enough to do something about it. That week, I went on a quiet rampage, not the kind with screaming or broken plates, but the kind where every spare moment, every break between Zoom meetings, and every hour after dark, I dug through old receipts, credit card statements, online orders, and email confirmations, trying to piece together the full picture of what had really been going on under my roof. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I already knew something shady was happening, but I needed the pattern, the consistency, the volume of it. And what I found made my stomach twist in that special way only betrayal can manage, the way it feels when someone doesn't just take from you, but does it while smiling and hugging you goodnight. First, there were the ride shares. Over 24 of them, spread across a few months, all charged to my Apple Pay. At first, I thought maybe they were using my phone. My mom had once borrowed it for a call when hers wasn't working. But then I remembered helping them set up their new phones that Lori had shipped to my house last summer, phones that I generously activated using my own information, just to make things easier. They were iPhones, and I'd logged in to help sync contacts and get them set up. What I hadn't realized was that they'd never logged me out. And so with every ride to the grocery store, doctor, or whatever errand they felt entitled to take, the bill came to me, silently, invisibly, like a tax on my own kindness. Then came the Amazon purchases. The bulk vitamins, the orthopedic socks, the strange kitchen gadgets, and the hardcover books about Mediterranean cooking, which no one in our house had ever expressed interest in. It wasn't just the volume of purchases, it was the fact that they never once mentioned them. I lived with these people, I saw them every day, and not once did my mother say, "Thank you for the pasta maker," even as it sat unopened on my counter for weeks. But the final straw wasn't what they spent. It was how Lori had helped set it all up and then positioned herself as the innocent middleman. Months ago, when my parents first complained that their phones were slow and out of date, she'd offered to handle it from her end. A week later, the phones arrived and she asked me to activate them. Since, as she put it, Mom and Dad don't understand any of this tech stuff. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with a tangle of cords and instruction manuals, annoyed but trying to be helpful. I had no idea I was giving them open access to my financial accounts in the process. When I went back into the Apple ID settings, there it was, my card, still active under their payment preferences, tucked neatly beneath their own names like a trap I'd laid for myself. I didn't want to believe they'd done it on purpose, but I also couldn't believe it was an accident. Because this wasn't just one or two charges. It was hundreds of dollars, over and over, and it wasn't like they were too proud to ask. They just never bothered. They never even mentioned it. I started saving the voicemails they'd left since leaving for their trip. They came in like clockwork. My mother's voice sugary sweet in some, guilt-ridden in others, and then edge of anger in the rest. One of them actually started with, "Hey honey, hope you're relaxing. Don't forget to feed the dog," and ended with a passive-aggressive sigh about how some people just aren't cut out for family. I saved every one of them. Not because I needed proof, although let's be honest, it helped, but because I needed to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, that what I was hearing was real, that this wasn't just a bad week or a moment of confusion. It was a pattern, a way of life they'd grown into so comfortably that any pushback from me felt like betrayal. Some nights I replayed the audio just to let the anger settle in. Other nights, I wandered the now quiet house, taking stock of what they'd left behind. I found drawers slightly open, like someone had been searching through them while I was asleep. A few of my files were out of order. Insurance papers shuffled, tax returns unfiled. I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't already been suspicious. But now, every out-of-place document felt like another fingerprint. Another tiny reminder that this wasn't just about boundaries being crossed. It was about privacy being violated in the most intimate, shameless way. It's amazing how clearly you can remember the moments you were too tired to stand up for yourself, once you realized those moments were being exploited. Like the time I got sick with the flu and still dragged myself out of bed to make dinner because my dad didn't like pre-packaged food. Or the night Lori called to say she couldn't come home for the holidays, but suggested I do something simple this year. And my mom jumped in to remind me that it wasn't about the food, it was about the love, even as she handed me a shopping list with 17 items on it and asked me to go out in the snow because she'd forgotten cranberry sauce. At some point in the spiral of discovery, I realized that I didn't just feel angry, I felt humiliated, because I had allowed it all to happen. I had rationalized their behavior, explained it away to my friends, even joked about it to my coworkers during virtual happy hours, like I was in on the joke, like I wasn't the punchline. But the truth was that I'd built my life around accommodating other people's comfort. And now that I had drawn one simple, non-negotiable boundary, they were reacting like I had burned the house down with them inside it. That was when I ordered a Ring camera and installed it above the front door. Not because I expected them to return immediately, though to be honest, I wouldn't have put it past them, but because I needed to feel like I was reclaiming something. Not just the house, but my sense of control, my dignity. I started watching the footage just to see what they did when they left. And what I saw made my skin crawl in a way I still haven't shaken off. My mom, the woman who used to weep during Hallmark movies and cry at every church bake sale, had stood outside my front door, key in hand, and whispered to Lori on speakerphone, "Don't worry, if something goes wrong, I've still got Rick across the street. He'll let us in if we say we're locked out." Then she laughed, this soft, tight-lipped giggle that sounded nothing like the woman who used to tuck me in at night and sing old Beatles songs off-key. It sounded like someone who had played the game long enough to believe they would always win. I paused the footage right there, hand trembling just a little, not from fear, but from clarity. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a strategy, and I'd been the mark for far too long. The more I dug, the more I realized that they hadn't just assumed I'd never push back. They were counting on it. And maybe they weren't entirely wrong, not yet. But they would be. There's a certain kind of silence that creeps into your life after years of being surrounded by other people's noise. People who think nothing of turning your living room into their theater, your kitchen into their diner, your weekends into their errands. And that silence, instead of being unsettling or eerie like I once feared it would be, turned out to be the most profoundly comforting sound I'd heard in over a year. When I dropped my parents off at the airport that Sunday morning, pretending for the final time that I was the good, obedient daughter who existed to make their plans run smoothly, I smiled and nodded and told them to send pictures, as my mother clutched her oversized beach tote and my father adjusted his travel pillow like some kind of seasoned vacationer. I even helped wheel their luggage to the check-in line and waved when they passed through security, all while knowing that by the time their plane landed in Florida, they would be officially locked out of the very house they'd spent the past 11 months pretending was theirs. I didn't rush through it, though. I took my time, drove home slowly with the windows down, enjoying the late autumn breeze for the first time in what felt like forever without the nagging feeling that someone was going to call me the second I walked through the door and ask me to heat up soup or check on that thing Dad heard in the basement. When I got back to the house, it was so quiet that I could hear the faint creak of the wood under my shoes and the soft hum of the refrigerator that I hadn't noticed in months, and I realized that this was the first time the space actually felt like it belonged to me again. I started with the locks, not because I thought they'd come back mid-trip, but because I needed a symbolic gesture to match the internal shift I was undergoing. Replacing the front door lock felt like more than home maintenance. It felt like reclaiming my autonomy in a way that no confrontation or argument ever could. As I turned the screw on the new deadbolt, I wasn't just installing a new security measure. I was drawing a line between who I had been and who I was done being. And it wasn't just the front door. I changed the back door too. I pulled the spare key from under the fake rock in the garden, the one my mother insisted we keep there just in case, and I smashed the rock into pieces with a hammer before tossing both the shards and the key into the trash. By the end of the day, I had also disabled their user profiles from the smart TV, wiped their information from the Wi-Fi router, and disconnected every device they had ever synced to my network. I found myself walking through the house with a sense of mission, collecting remnants of their occupation, prescription bottles, reading glasses, half-finished crossword puzzles, and placing them methodically into labeled boxes, not with anger, but with the kind of cold, focused clarity that can only come from someone who has been pushed too far for too long and is finally ready to act. Their belongings, neatly packed, now sat in the garage by the door, with polite notes taped to each. Stan's winter coats, Diane's toiletries, photo albums, kitchenware, Dad's old radio. It didn't take long for the voicemails to start, and they came in waves, each one with its own flavor of guilt, denial, and escalating rage. The first few were mild, my mom's voice layered with practiced concern as she said things like, "Sweetie, I think the key isn't working, maybe the lock is jammed, and we must have made a mistake. Can you check the back door?" But by the third message, the mask had already begun to slip, and my dad's voice took over, growling, "What the hell is this, Tara? Are you trying to be funny? You locked your own parents out of the house? We raised you better than this." And then Lori, of course it was only a matter of time, called me from her hotel room or poolside cabana, or wherever she was pretending to care from, and left a message that began with feigned empathy and ended with an overt threat. "I'm not trying to pick sides here, but you're making this really hard on all of us. If something happens to them because you left them stranded, I don't know how you're going to live with that." Every call made it clear that they still didn't get it, not one of them. They truly believed they were the victims in this story, that I had blindsided them without warning, when in reality, the only thing I'd done was finally respond in kind to over a year's worth of silent theft, emotional blackmail, and self-serving manipulation. They had been living rent-free, literally and figuratively, not just in my house, but in my life, and I had been footing the bill for everything from their takeout cravings to their resentment of me for not being as accommodating as they believed a daughter ought to be. What none of them seemed to understand was that I wasn't punishing them. I was protecting myself. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was refusing to let them keep hurting me. And yes, I anticipated backlash. I expected them to reach out to the rest of the family, to spin a narrative in which I was the cold, ungrateful daughter who had left her aging parents out in the cold, while she sat at home with a glass of wine and a cruel smirk. I knew there would be judgment and gossip and dramatic calls from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, all asking the same loaded question. What happened between you and your folks? But I didn't care. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't care about being the villain in someone else's story, especially not a story they'd been writing without me, using my time, my energy, and my damn credit card. The next morning, as I sipped coffee in blessed silence, Rick from across the street knocked on my door. He's been my neighbor for over a decade, a retired firefighter with a deep voice and a quiet way about him that always made me feel like he saw more than he let on. He handed me a misdelivered piece of mail, something from the electric company addressed to my dad, and then, almost as an afterthought, said, "Your mom and dad stopped by yesterday, asked me if I had a spare key to your place. Said they got locked out by accident." He paused, gave me a long look, then added, "I told them I didn't have one, didn't seem right." I nodded, took the envelope, and thanked him. But what I didn't say, what I didn't need to say, was that he had just confirmed what I already knew. They had never seen me as a person with boundaries worth respecting. They thought I was a fallback plan, a doormat with a job title, the daughter who didn't complain enough to be taken seriously, and who didn't raise her voice loud enough to be feared. Well, they were right about one thing. I never used to do anything. But now I had. And the look in Rick's eyes told me I wasn't the only one who finally noticed. There's a difference between being alone and being left alone, and it wasn't until the house had been cleared of their voices, their footsteps, their whispered plotting behind closed doors, that I finally understood how much of my life had been swallowed by noise that never served me. At first, after changing the locks and fielding the tidal wave of guilt-laced voicemails and veiled threats, there was a kind of high, a low, steady buzz of adrenaline that came from finally acting instead of endlessly accommodating. But that buzz wore off within a week, and what came after was a strange stillness that settled in every corner of the house like dust in a long abandoned attic. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't even guilt, not really. It was more like a long-delayed inventory of everything I'd given away in the name of peace. It was during that quiet stretch, days marked not by confrontation, but by a complete lack of it, that I finally allowed myself to unpack what had really been going on, not just in the past year, but in the decades that led up to it. Because the truth was, the chaos of my parents' stay hadn't come out of nowhere. It had only amplified the patterns I had learned to live under long before I owned a mortgage or paid for someone else's plane tickets. The control, the entitlement, the assumption that my time, my space, and my energy were extensions of what they were owed, all of that had been there since I was a kid. I had just been too well trained, too tightly wound in their version of family duty, to recognize it for what it was: manipulation draped in a veil of tradition. I started going to therapy again, mostly because I needed to say things out loud to someone who wouldn't try to spin them into an obligation or an emotional invoice. During one session, I found myself recounting the way my mother used to say, "You're so mature for your age," every time she handed me a chore or an emotional burden that no child should have carried. I remembered how my father used to praise my independence, but never once asked what I needed, how Lori got away with calling once a week and still received more verbal affection than I had heard in 20 years. The therapist didn't say much. She just nodded and waited, which was more validating than all the thank yous I never got. But as I started pulling at those old threads, I also started noticing just how deep the damage had gone. I found out, quite by accident, that my parents had quietly changed their mailing address to my home nearly 6 months before they moved in, meaning I'd likely been listed as their legal residence for longer than I even realized. I also discovered that several of their bills, utilities, subscriptions, even a Medicare statement, had been redirected to my house, and worse, set to auto-pay on a card they had no right to be using. It was my old backup credit card, one I hadn't touched in over a year, And the only reason I found out at all was because I received a fraud alert when they tried to use it for a large furniture purchase. The GoFundMe was the final bitter cherry on top, and I found it by accident when a distant cousin shared it on Facebook with the caption, "Let's help Aunt Diane and Uncle Stan get back on their feet." The page was titled "Escape from a Toxic Home" and featured a photo of my parents standing outside my front porch, looking vaguely tired and heavily edited. The description said they had been emotionally mistreated by a family member who had grown controlling and paranoid, and that they were trying to relocate to a safer, more welcoming environment. And while the name Tara never appeared in the write-up, it didn't take much connecting of dots to realize that I was the faceless villain in their morality tale. What really drove the knife in was that the campaign had raised over $2,000 in under 48 hours. Money that, from what I could gather, Lori had set up and was actively managing. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't send an angry email or fire off a cease and desist. Instead, I did something that felt more powerful than any confrontation ever could. I hired a lawyer, not because I planned to sue my family, though God knows I could have, but because I needed to understand how deep their entitlement had buried itself into my legal and financial life. The lawyer, a calm and meticulous woman named Angela, spent 2 hours walking me through everything I hadn't even thought to worry about: potential fraud, mail tampering, power of attorney concerns, and the steps I could take to distance myself permanently, legally, from people who had never once asked whether I was okay with the role they'd shoved me into. Once the eviction notices were drawn up, formal, impersonal, and delivered by certified mail, I took a long walk through my neighborhood. It was the first time in months that I didn't feel like I had to get back in a hurry. I passed familiar houses, nodded at a few faces I usually ignored, and found myself standing outside the church 2 blocks over, the one my parents used to attend back when appearances still mattered to them. I remembered sitting in those pews as a child, listening to sermons about forgiveness and sacrifice, and I thought about how easily those lessons were used against people like me, the ones who never fought back until the damage was already done. A few nights later, Lori finally called, not to apologize, not to explain, but to scream. Her voice was tight, high-pitched, frantic in a way I hadn't heard before. "They're old, Tara. What the hell do you expect them to do? You think this little stunt of yours makes you look strong? You're just bitter, always have been." I let her finish. Didn't interrupt, didn't offer a single defense. When she ran out of breath, I said the only thing I needed to. "They just spent $3,000 on a resort. I think they'll manage." Then I hung up, blocked her number, and added her to the list of people who no longer had access to my time or my peace. The strangest part of all this was how the house began to feel different. Not just quieter, but warmer. Even though no one had touched the thermostat, even though nothing about the structure had changed, it suddenly felt like a place I actually lived in, instead of a space I was renting from ghosts who thought they still owned me. I started sleeping better, eating better, noticing the little things I used to overlook, the way the morning light hit the countertop, the sound of the wind in the trees behind the yard, the comfort of knowing that if something was out of place, it was because I had put it there. And yet there was still a shadow over all of it, something not quite settled, not quite finished. Because even though I had reclaimed the space, the name, the finances, and the narrative, there was still the voice, my mother's voice mostly, in the back of my head saying, "You'll regret this one day. You'll be alone, and you'll wish you had family to call." But what she didn't understand, what she never allowed herself to understand, was that it's better to be alone by choice than surrounded by people who treat your life like a service they're entitled to. And the next time someone asks me what happened with my parents, I'll tell them exactly what I've told myself every day since I changed those locks. Nothing happened. I just finally woke up. There's a certain kind of peace that doesn't arrive all at once with fireworks or fanfare, but instead seeps in slowly, like light through a thick curtain just beginning to part. And when it finally settles over you, you realize you've been holding your breath for years without even knowing it. That's exactly what the weeks after cutting them off felt like. quiet, not in the hollow, lonely way people seem to fear when they hear the word estrangement, but in the deeply necessary sense of finally stepping out of a storm that had raged so long you forgot what silence even sounded like. I expected there to be more fallout, more escalation, some dramatic showdown involving suitcases on my porch or a tearful apology outside my door. But there was none of that. And that absence spoke louder than anything they could have said. Instead, there was simply nothing. No texts, no voicemails, no knocks on the door. After the initial barrage of calls and the GoFundMe drama, the noise just stopped as abruptly as it had started. And while I'd like to believe it was because they realized the damage they'd done and chose to back off, I knew better. The truth, as I eventually learned, was far pettier and far more satisfying in the kind of quietly vindicating way that doesn't require you to lift a finger. Because as it turned out, Lori had learned, in the span of less than 2 weeks, exactly what I had spent the last 11 months living with. It happened in stages, and the first whisper of it came through social media, the same way so much of the chaos had started. A mutual friend of mine and Lori's, one of those people who posts vague Bible quotes and family updates but never directly comments on anything controversial, shared a picture of her kids at a local park, and in the background, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it, was a figure that looked unmistakably like my mother, sitting on a bench under a big straw sun hat, staring straight ahead like someone counting the minutes until someone else brought her a sandwich. I wouldn't have thought anything of it except that the caption read, "Quick trip to visit the in-laws. Never again, LOL. Curious, I clicked over to Lori's page, which I hadn't checked since blocking her number, and though I couldn't see much, one of her husband's public posts was still visible, and it read, "Week 2 of Full House madness. Pray for strength and patience." That was all I needed to piece it together. They hadn't gone back to Florida. They had gone to her, and from the sounds of it, it wasn't going well. In the weeks that followed, more breadcrumbs appeared, little glimpses of what their life had become now that they were someone else's problem. I found out from another cousin who called me out of the blue that Lori had taken my parents in for the time being, but after a few days of clashing schedules, barking dogs, and nonstop complaining, she had essentially begged her church's outreach team to help her relocate them to a retirement community that was supposed to be temporary but had quickly become the long-term plan. Apparently, the very same people who had judged me for abandoning our parents were now quietly whispering behind closed doors about how Lori bit off more than she could chew. I didn't gloat. I didn't call her. I didn't send any messages or reply to the few relatives who suddenly seemed interested in hearing my side. But I did do one small thing, something so petty and passive that it felt almost childish. And yet it brought me more satisfaction than any screaming match or final confrontation ever could. I sent Lori an edible arrangement. Nothing extravagant, just a small basket of pineapple flowers and chocolate-dipped strawberries with a note that read, "Congratulations on your new house guests. Wishing you all the peace and patience in the world." I never heard back, and I didn't need to, because sometimes silence isn't just absence, it's acknowledgement. The last message I received from my mother came 3 weeks after the locks were changed. It came late at night when I was half asleep on the couch with a movie playing and a half-empty glass of wine resting on the armrest. My phone buzzed once, no caller ID, straight to voicemail, and when I played it back, her voice was low, quiet, not the brittle chirp she used when trying to manipulate, but something almost hollow. She said, "I hope you're happy, Tara. You'll be alone for the holidays. You'll regret this. Maybe not now, but one day when we're gone. And all you have left is this big empty house and no one who cares. You'll wish you'd done things differently." She hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there listening to that message 3 times, not because I wasn't sure how I felt, but because I wanted to be certain. And I was, is because what she saw as a threat, I saw as a promise. For the first time in years, I wasn't dreading the holidays. I wasn't worried about turkey cooking times or seating arrangements or passive-aggressive comments about my love life. I wasn't spending money I didn't have on food I didn't want to cook for people who didn't see me. I was free. And yes, I would be alone. But being alone isn't the same as being lonely. Not when your space is finally yours, your peace finally intact, your time finally your own. That December, I bought myself a small tree, nothing grand, just enough to make the house smell like pine, and decorated it in silence while soft jazz played in the background. I wrapped exactly 3 presents, one for my neighbor Rick, who had quietly supported me in ways he probably didn't even realize, one for myself, a leather-bound journal with pages I planned to fill with something other than frustration, and one I never delivered, a box of cookies addressed to the retirement home, which I eventually decided to keep for myself. On Christmas morning, I woke up late, made cinnamon rolls from scratch, and sat in my sunlit kitchen with a second cup of coffee, staring out the window at a yard finally cleared of footprints that weren't mine. I didn't feel victorious or vengeful. I just felt like myself, fully for the first time in longer than I could remember. In the end, there was no dramatic confrontation, no apology letter, no realization on their part that what they'd done was wrong, but I stopped waiting for that. I stopped needing it. Because sometimes revenge isn't about grand gestures or vindictive acts. Sometimes it's as simple as living well in the absence of people who only knew how to take. And when I think back to all the years I spent trying to earn love by giving more than I had, I realize now that the most powerful thing I ever did wasn't changing the locks. It was finally changing the story.